April 29th, 1945. Berlin. The city smolders, streets littered with rubble and abandoned vehicles. In a ruined Gestapo office, papers lie scattered, telephones dead and silent. Amid the chaos, Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, slips through the shadows, seen by few, accounted for by none. Flames flicker against broken walls as he disappears into the streets, a ghost in a city collapsing around him. Where could the man who orchestrated terror across Europe vanish to as the Reich falls? And if Müller could disappear, who else might have slipped away, leaving no trace? In the next minutes, we'll follow the vanished, tracing the paths of those who slipped through history's grasp. April 30th, 1945. Hitler's body burned in the garden as Berlin smoldered under Soviet artillery. The city was chaos, smoke, rubble, and fleeing civilians moving through streets pocked with craters and debris. Many SS men remained fiercely loyal to the regime until the very end, refusing to surrender even as the walls of the Reich crumbled. Some formed small defensive pockets, trying to hold key intersections or protect retreating officers, their uniforms streaked with dust, blood, and the grime of a city in ruins. In the midst of this collapse, the remnants of the regime's power became scattered and fragile, like smoke twisting through the ruins. In the heart of the city, Gestapo headquarters on Wilhelmstrasse lay in eerie silence. Shredded papers littered the floors, desks lay overturned, and telephones were ripped from walls. Files detailing arrests, executions, and intelligence were scattered across the office, a testament to the machine that had ruled Europe with fear. Outside, abandoned vehicles and barricades marked the last desperate attempts to hold the streets. The emptiness of the building reflected the sudden void left by those who had commanded it. Elsewhere, captured SS guards faced instant justice. Some were executed in courtyards or streets, punished by surviving prisoners or advancing Allied forces. These were short, brutal sentences, often carried out without trial, leaving only the echo of their crimes in the air, mingling with the smoke of the city. Amid the chaos, other figures slipped into shadows. SS officers who had once commanded fear simply disappeared. Heinrich Müller was one of them. Last seen in the Gestapo headquarters, he vanished without a trace, leaving questions that would linger for decades. Others followed in the same invisible footsteps. Arthur Axmann, leader of the Hitler Youth, was briefly spotted moving through the ruins, then gone. Otto Skorzeny, the commando famous for daring raids, melted into the chaos. Karl Wolff, close aide to Hitler, vanished from Allied tracking almost immediately. Some disappeared within the streets of Berlin, some into forests, and some may have left Europe entirely. What became of them after the war? How did they survive? And who truly knew their paths? Using the latest evidence from declassified Allied reports, intelligence files, and survivor testimonies, we will follow them one by one. We will trace the vanished, explore the last glimpses of their lives, and uncover the shadows they left behind. Stories that history has never fully revealed. Until today. Stationed in the Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse in Berlin, Heinrich Müller had directed mass arrests of political dissidents, Jews, and resistance fighters. His orders led to the rounding up of communists in Hamburg in 1933, the suppression of the White Rose movement in Munich in 1943, and the deportation of thousands from Vienna and Prague to concentration camps. He supervised the Einsatzgruppen indirectly, coordinating the machinery that tracked, captured, and sent victims to their deaths, all while maintaining a personal image of meticulous efficiency and invisibility. Born on April 28, 1900, in Munich, Müller grew up in a modest household, the son of a postal worker. Early on, he showed discipline, focus, and an analytical mind. He joined the Bavarian police in the 1920s, rising through the ranks because of his keen eye for detail and ability to anticipate threats. He married young, and while his family lived quietly in Munich, Müller devoted himself entirely to his work, climbing the SS ranks after joining in 1933. Reinhard Heydrich recognized his organizational talent, and by 1939, Müller became chief of the Gestapo, entrusted with enforcing Nazi terror on an unprecedented scale. His career was a blend of ruthless efficiency and complete invisibility. Even among the highest SS ranks, few ever saw him in person. By late April 1945, Berlin was a city on fire. Soviet troops had surrounded the city, artillery reducing buildings to rubble, civilians fleeing through craters and burning streets. Amid the chaos, Müller was last seen moving through the Gestapo headquarters on Wilhelmstrasse, directing the remaining officers, checking lists of detainees, and attempting to maintain control as the city collapsed. His office was later found in disarray, shredded papers, scattered files, and telephones ripped from the walls. No body was ever recovered. Allied intelligence intercepted communications suggesting Müller had left the bunker area, but the trail vanished quickly. Some believed he died in the rubble, crushed in the final days of Berlin's destruction. Others speculated that he was secretly recruited by Allied intelligence, valued for his knowledge of Nazi networks, and quietly moved out of Europe. Fleeting sightings in Austria and other locations surfaced in the late 1940s, but none were confirmed. His family in Munich never received word of him, leaving his fate an enduring mystery. Müller's disappearance was not just the vanishing of a man, it was the beginning of a pattern. If someone so central, so closely watched, could slip from Berlin without leaving a trace, it raised a question historians and investigators would return to again and again. Who else among the SS vanished into the shadows? As Berlin collapsed, Axmann made his move. Using false identities and the chaos of mass evacuation, he slipped out of the city and traveled through Bavaria, moving from towns like Bad Reichenhall to small villages near Rosenheim. Allied counterintelligence corps reports mention a man matching his description being spotted at refugee centers in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, carrying a small satchel and speaking cautiously to those around him. CIC detectives, including agents from the Munich station, tried to piece together his trail, noting brief interactions with locals and sightings at small inns, but each lead vanished as quickly as it appeared. In these towns, Axmann blended with the throngs of civilians fleeing the Soviet advance, his uniform gone, his real name unspoken, leaving only fleeting impressions of a shadow moving among the desperate. He carefully avoided checkpoints and patrols, slipping along back roads and forested paths, using knowledge of the terrain he had memorized from childhood trips through Bavaria's hills. In the months that followed, he remained hidden, relying on sympathetic contacts from the Hitler Youth Network and local acquaintances who had once been loyal to the regime. Eventually, he surrendered voluntarily to American forces near the town of Passau, where an interrogator named Captain William Stokes recorded his statements and verified his identity. Unlike others who disappeared permanently, Axmann navigated post-war Germany with relative safety, spending weeks under surveillance but facing no formal charges that would imprison him long-term. Released, he settled quietly in Lower Saxony, working in a technical office and avoiding politics. He lived under the radar, rarely drawing attention, and for decades the public knew little of the man who had once commanded Germany's youth. He maintained minimal contact with family, who had survived the war in Hagen, and spent his later years quietly in Hanover, where he died in 1996. Yet while some faded quietly into post-war Germany, others moved through Europe in a far more daring fashion, slipping across borders and avoiding capture with audacious skill. One such figure would become known not for youth programs or bureaucratic control, but for feats of daring and impossible missions that confounded Allied intelligence. Directed daring operations across Europe, Otto Skorzeny became one of the most infamous SS commandos of the Third Reich. He led missions that few could imagine, from the audacious 1943 rescue of Benito Mussolini in Gran Sasso, Italy, to sabotage operations behind Allied lines in France and the Netherlands. Skorzeny oversaw units of the Waffen-SS trained in unconventional warfare, targeting infrastructure, disrupting supply lines, and coordinating assaults that killed and captured hundreds of enemy soldiers, leaving Allied intelligence struggling to predict his next move. By the end of the war, his reputation for precision, speed, and boldness had earned him the nickname, the most dangerous man in Europe. Born on June 12, 1908, in Vienna, Austria-Hungary, Skorzeny grew up in a middle-class family. His father worked as a railway inspector. His mother ran the household. In youth, he excelled in athletics, fencing, and marksmanship, skills that would later define his military career. He joined the Austrian army before the Anschluss, and, after the Nazi takeover, moved into the SS, seeking opportunities to lead elite units and undertake missions others would not attempt. Married with children, he kept his family away from frontline operations, dedicating himself entirely to the command of specialized combat groups. As the Reich crumbled in 1945, Skorzeny avoided capture by moving swiftly through Germany and Austria. Using the networks he had built within the SS and Waffen-SS, he relied on safe houses, forged documents, and secret mountain routes across the Alps. Allied intelligence intercepted occasional reports of him in towns like Innsbruck and Salzburg, but each sighting vanished into rumor almost immediately. By late 1945, he had reached Spain, a haven for former SS officers, moving among the displaced with careful precision. Post-war testimonies and photographs place him in Madrid and Alicante, and reports hint at his involvement in covert operations in Egypt and Syria, advising paramilitary groups and consulting on security measures for governments there. Briefly arrested in 1947 in Austria, he was released due to insufficient evidence linking him directly to war crimes. In the decades after, he lived between Spain, Germany, and other countries, consulting quietly on military matters and cultivating the image of a retired soldier. He died in Madrid on July 5, 1975, leaving behind only fragments of evidence, post-war photographs, scattered intelligence reports, and testimonies that hinted at his activities, while much of his life after the war remained shrouded in mystery. Skorzeny's path shows how some SS officers vanished not just within Europe, but across continents, embedding themselves in new conflicts. And as one shadow moved through the Mediterranean, another figure, a high-ranking SS officer involved in brutal counterinsurgency campaigns, was maneuvering through post-war Europe, a man whose fate would remain elusive. Crushed villages and scorched forests stretched across Eastern Europe as the Red Army advanced in early 1945. Among the officers retreating from the front lines was a man whose reputation was built on crushing resistance with ruthless efficiency. Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski commanded SS units that had brutally suppressed uprisings in Poland and Belarus, including the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, where tens of thousands of civilians died under his orders. He moved through the chaos of retreat with a single goal: survival, slipping eastward as Soviet troops closed in on his positions and leaving behind towns that still bore the scars of his campaigns. Bach-Zelewski was born on March 1, 1899, in Lauenburg, then part of the German Empire. His father was a civil servant, and his mother ran the household. He served in the German army during World War I before joining the Freikorps, the paramilitary groups that fought in post-war uprisings. By the 1930s, he had joined the SS, rising steadily through the ranks thanks to his willingness to carry out the most brutal orders without question. Married with children, he maintained a household in Pomerania, though his family life was largely separate from the violence he orchestrated on the Eastern Front. As Soviet forces pushed west in early 1945, Bach-Zelewski moved from Poland through Silesia, using secondary roads and forested paths to evade capture. His units were disbanded or surrendered around him, but he continued to move, sometimes alone, sometimes with a small retinue of loyal aides. Allied intelligence and later Nuremberg trial transcripts recorded only fragments of his journey. Sightings were rare and unconfirmed. He used his rank and connections to negotiate with local authorities and military units, eventually slipping into areas controlled by Western allies rather than being caught by the Soviets he had fought so fiercely against. He was eventually captured by American forces months later and faced interrogation. At the Nuremberg trials, he gave testimony about operations in Poland and the Baltic states, admitting to some of his actions while deflecting responsibility for others. He was later tried in West Germany for war crimes, but many of the charges were dropped or ended in reduced sentences, allowing him to live out his remaining years in relative quiet. He died in 1972, decades after the war, a man whose past had been marked by violence and whose escape had briefly allowed him to evade justice. Bach-Zelewski's retreat illustrates another path of the vanished. Some fled to Western zones, some returned to civilian life, and others vanished completely into foreign lands. And as one shadow was contained in Europe, another would move beyond its borders, disappearing into distant countries where Allied and local authorities struggled to trace them. Coordinating the machinery of the Reich, Karl Wolff moved through Berlin and Rome with authority few could question. As Heinrich Himmler's personal aide and chief of SS administration in Italy, he oversaw logistics, troop movements, and the coordination of SS operations across occupied territories. He was instrumental in deportations and security operations, including actions in northern Italy, where thousands were sent to concentration camps. In the final days of the war, Wolff maneuvered through collapsing command lines and Allied advances, slipping into a gray area between detention and freedom that few officers could navigate. Born on May 13, 1900, in Darmstadt, Germany, Wolff came from a middle-class family. His father was a bank clerk, and his mother ran the household. He served briefly in World War I before entering the civil service and later joining the SS in 1931. Ambitious and politically astute, Wolff rose steadily, gaining a reputation for discretion and loyalty. Married in the late 1920s with 2 children, he maintained a family life that contrasted sharply with the brutality of his professional duties, a household largely insulated from the chaos of his wartime actions. By 1945, as Allied forces pressed into Italy and Germany, Wolff moved cautiously. He was briefly detained by American forces in 1945, but was mysteriously released after questioning, a decision that later puzzled intelligence officers. Allied intelligence files noted that he remained under monitoring for months, tracked through contacts and correspondence, yet he largely faded from active records. For years, Western intelligence kept fragments of his movements, noting meetings with former SS officers and occasional appearances in Munich and other parts of West Germany. Post-war, Wolff lived quietly under surveillance, avoiding the public eye while the world around him reconstructed. He never matched the fate of many of his contemporaries, navigating a life that allowed him to remain largely free, while historians and investigators pieced together his wartime activities from declassified documents, testimonies, and archival records. His knowledge of SS networks and administrative structures made him a person of interest to intelligence agencies, yet he lived out his life without returning to political activity. He died in Munich on July 17, 1984, decades after the war ended, leaving behind only fragments of evidence that hinted at both his complicity and his surprising post-war freedom. Wolff's quiet survival shows how some vanished in plain sight, moving under the gaze of Western authorities, while others sought shadows far from Europe entirely. As one path faded into obscurity in Germany, another group of former SS officers would journey into new lands, establishing networks and roles in regions like the Middle East, where tracking them became even more difficult. Organizing transports and coordinating deportations across Europe, Alois Brunner was a figure of fear and precision. As Adolf Eichmann's deputy in the SS, he orchestrated the movement of tens of thousands of Jews from Austria, France, and Greece to extermination camps, often personally overseeing selections and ensuring quotas were met. In Vienna, in 1942, he supervised the deportation of nearly 50,000 Jews, and in France, he managed operations from Drancy internment camp, directing hundreds of convoys to Auschwitz. When the Reich fell, Brunner disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind a trail of terror and no trace of his immediate whereabouts. Brunner was born on April 8, 1912, in Nadkut, then part of Austria-Hungary. His father worked as a teacher and his mother as a housekeeper. As a young man, he studied law, but quickly joined the Austrian Nazi Party and the SAS, drawn to their promise of power and ideological order. Ambitious and ruthless, he impressed his superiors with his efficiency and willingness to carry out orders without question. Married with a family, he kept personal details hidden, even from those close to him, and his private life remained largely separated from the crimes he executed across Europe. After the war, Brunner avoided capture through a network of escape routes, the so-called rat lines, used by many former Nazis. He first moved to Austria, then Germany, and ultimately found refuge in Syria by the late 1940s. Intelligence reports from the 1950s through the 1980s confirm his presence in Damascus, where he lived openly and was reportedly assisted by local intelligence services. He taught military techniques, advised on security matters, and maintained contacts with former Nazis and sympathizers, all while evading international efforts to bring him to justice. Mossad launched several operations to track and capture Brunner, including a raid in the early 1960s, but he managed to escape. Photographs and intercepted communications confirmed his continued residence in Damascus, and interviews with former operatives revealed he had been in contact with European intelligence agencies and other Middle Eastern governments. Despite numerous attempts, Brunner was never captured, and his presence in Syria remained largely uncontested until his reported death around 2010. His life after the war became a symbol of how far some Nazis could flee, building new lives in regions beyond Europe's reach. Brunner's path demonstrates the extreme reach of the vanished SS officers. Some were trapped in Europe, some returned to quiet civilian lives, and some, like him, embedded themselves in distant lands. While he eluded capture for decades, the next figure we follow would challenge investigators in a very different way, vanishing into Europe with a reputation for meticulous planning and cunning that kept him out of sight for years. During the World War II, Emil Augsburg worked within the RSHA, the SS's intelligence arm, gathering information, coordinating interrogations, and helping identify targets for deportation and execution. In Warsaw and Krakow during 1943–44, he compiled lists of resistance members and civilians deemed enemies of the Reich, passing the names to Einsatzgruppen units and overseeing some arrests. His meticulous approach to intelligence made him both effective and dangerous, feared by those under surveillance, yet almost invisible to the broader public. As the Allies advanced into Germany in 1945, Augsburg vanished into the chaos, leaving only scattered traces of his movements behind. Augsburg was born on January 18, 1904, in Berlin, Germany, into a working-class family. His father was a machinist and his mother a homemaker. He studied law and political science, but the rise of the Nazi Party drew him toward the SS, which he joined in 1933. Known for his quiet demeanor and analytical mind, he quickly moved into intelligence work, combining bureaucratic skill with field operations. Married in the late 1930s, Augsburg maintained a private family life largely separated from the atrocities he oversaw, keeping his domestic world insulated from the brutal campaigns he orchestrated. By April 1945, Augsburg had retreated from his Berlin post as Soviet forces approached, moving through Bavaria and northern Germany. Post-war intelligence files from the American CIC and later West German authorities document fleeting sightings of him in Hamburg and Munich. He assumed false identities, rented small apartments, and avoided any official registration, blending into post-war civilian life. Investigators often found themselves a step behind, following rumors, intercepted letters, and the occasional neighbor testimony. Even when they had a lead, he had moved on, leaving the trail cold. In the decades that followed, Augsburg remained elusive. He occasionally surfaced in intelligence reports, sometimes under another name, living quietly in West Germany. He avoided public attention, refrained from writing memoirs, and lived apart from political activity. Unlike officers who fled to distant continents, he remained in Europe, yet his life was still hidden. Largely unknown to authorities and historians for years, he died quietly, reportedly in the 1980s, leaving only fragments of records and memories in the files of post-war investigators. Augsburg's story illustrates the strange limbo of the vanished. Even within the continent, some SS officers could disappear, evade justice, and live out their lives in anonymity. And as one shadow quietly ended its journey in Germany, another was preparing to vanish across continents, moving into regions far from Allied reach, where tracking him would become a near impossible task. Poland and Czechoslovakia were the stages of Max Täubner's authority, where he oversaw forced labor assignments that kept German war production moving. He moved from camp to camp, ensuring quotas were met, rations controlled, and any resistance crushed. In the spring of 1945, as Soviet and American forces advanced, the camps he managed were abandoned or liberated, and Täubner disappeared into the chaos. Witnesses in small towns along the Austrian border later reported seeing a man matching his description, moving cautiously among the streams of refugees, yet no one could confirm where he ultimately went. Täubner was born on November 3, 1909, in Chemnitz, Germany, into a modest family. His father worked in a textile factory, and his mother managed the home. He joined the SS in the mid-1930s, drawn by opportunity and the promise of steady career advancement. Married with one child, he maintained a household removed from the camps where he exercised his authority, keeping his domestic life and professional brutality sharply separated. His rise in the SS was steady but unremarkable. A mid-level officer whose efficiency and loyalty earned him postings in several occupied territories without ever reaching the top echelons of command. As the Third Reich collapsed, Täubner moved from Poland through southern Germany toward Austria. Local police and townsfolk noted strangers who were cautious, always avoiding attention, often traveling by night or in small groups. Allied intelligence later collected reports from these towns, cataloging sightings of men suspected to be former SS officers, but Täubner's trail grew cold. He never registered with authorities under his real name, and post-war investigators could find no confirmed records of emigration or capture. For decades, his fate remained a mystery. Some historians speculate he assumed a false identity and emigrated, possibly to South America or the Middle East, following the same routes many SS officers took. Others suggest he may have lived quietly in Austria or Germany under an assumed name, blending into post-war society without attracting attention. His disappearance reflects the strange duality of the vanished. Some were hunted relentlessly, some surrendered, and some simply faded into obscurity. Täubner's story closes the circle of those who vanished in 1945, yet it also opens new questions. Some vanished in the shadows of the war's final days, while others only recently left the world, their lives and secrets only now reaching an end, leaving behind the faintest traces of the men who once wielded so much power and disappeared without a trace. Unlike other SS officers, Walter Rauff worked as an engineer, designing mobile gas vans that carried out mass killings across occupied Europe. In 1942 and 1943, these vans were deployed in Poland, the Soviet Union, and the Balkans, transporting victims under the guise of relocation and killing them with exhaust fumes before reaching any camp. Rauff oversaw operations in Dresden and Vienna, coordinating with Einsatzgruppen units and local police to implement these systems. Rauff was born on June 19, 1906, in Hamburg, Germany, into a family of modest means. His father worked as a shipyard engineer, and his mother managed the home. Educated in engineering and mechanics, he joined the Nazi Party in 1931 and entered the SS in 1933, quickly moving into roles that combined technical expertise with ideological zeal. Married with 2 children, Rauff's domestic life remained hidden from his professional brutality. His engineering skills and methodical nature made him a trusted officer, and his work left a deadly imprint that would haunt Europe long after the war ended. After Germany's surrender, Rauff initially remained in hiding within southern Germany, moving through Bavaria and the Black Forest. Allied intelligence tracked fragments of his movements, but never captured him. By 1949, he had escaped via one of the rat lines that carried former Nazis through Italy and Spain, eventually reaching Chile. Documents from the Chilean government, later declassified, show that he found employment in technical roles and maintained contact with expatriate German networks. Testimonies from European intelligence agents in the 1950s and 1960s confirmed that he was living openly, yet evading any international prosecution, despite multiple Mossad and Interpol manhunts. In Chile, Rauff continued to live under his own name for decades, respected in certain circles for his technical expertise, while survivors and authorities watched from afar, frustrated at the inability to bring him to justice. He died on May 14, 1984, reportedly in Santiago, leaving a trail of documents, correspondence, and testimonies that confirmed his presence but never led to a trial. His life after the war illustrated the stark reality. Some officers vanished only to resurface in distant lands, their crimes partially documented but never fully punished. The war ended, yet the shadows of the vanished linger. The chaos, the destruction, the collapse of order, everything allowed them to slip away, unnoticed, almost invisible. History watches and wonders, but some traces may never be found. In the next video, we'll explore those who resurfaced decades later, living hidden lives among us.